It's murder. It had seemed pretty bad when I had undergone the test twice in the early days, but now it was hellish. Bob looked at me. Is that the best you can do, for Christ's sake? Give me another shot. This was against all the rules, and I knew it. But what are friends for? This time it was better, but by no means as good as the book said it should be. There was a moment's silence. I suppose you really do want to fly again? Of course. I'm damned if I'm going to sit around watching all the other guys. And for God's sake, don't send me to sit on a bloody airfield for the rest of the war, he sighed. Go on then, you crazy fool. He moved to stow away all his gear. But don't fall in again, Hans. That last effort frightened me. He grinned. Nowhere near as much as it frightened me. And thanks for the let-off. You might have done better if I'd pushed the bloody tube somewhere else. Come on for a drink. As we approached Sydney Heads, we flew off our aircraft and landed at Nowra, out in the sticks of New South Wales. This was the Navy's first mobile naval air station, Monab, designed to be picked up, packed up, and moved at the drop of a hat to God knows where. Commander Nunnally, a friendly, charming little man with an elfish glint in his eyes, was in charge. He had a mixed bag under his command, some good, some bad, but it was 1945, and the scraping of the barrel for recruits was nearing the bottom. We flew for a couple of days, then hightailed it for Sydney for a short leave. We lived aboard the ship, and were faintly surprised to find her high and dry in the fine new graving dock at Woolloomooloo. Inspection of the ship had revealed that the centre propeller shaft had developed a wobble in its tunnel, caused through deterioration of the lignum vitae glands in the shaft tube, which had reached serious proportions. Time did not allow for lengthy repair work, so the propeller and its shaft were removed, and the tunnel, from which the shaft emerged to the water, was sealed most effectively by an enormous streamlined steel sheath. The biggest and toughest contraceptive in the world, as the boys named it. In Sydney we went to 1 or 2 nightclubs and indulged in a bit of drinking. This was a bit erratic, for I don't think we ever really understood Australian licensing laws, infinitely madder than our own. So far as we could see, the pubs opened for about 2 hours between 5 and 7 p.m., during which the entire male population of Sydney erupted from its offices, banks, warehouses or whatever, and invaded the nearest hostelry, where bloody battles ensued, the weakest going to the wall, their thirst unassuaged. Thirsts appeared to be phenomenal, and to stand in the way of an Aussie making his tank-like advance upon a pint of beer was a hazardous blunder to make. All too soon we were back at Nowra. We resumed our flying practice and made the most of the modest and restricted pastimes available to us. A few of the lads even found some girls, where from God knows. All I could see in the district was sheep. The Nowra of those days was a drab little town in the middle of a great dusty plain, comprising one very long, very dusty main street, lined with wooden frame houses, shops and pubs. All had wooden rails on which to tie up one's horse, very Hollywood. Johnny Hastings, who had insisted on sharing our exile out in the backwoods, organised a concert, well, an entertainment, for the local inhabitants. I must say it went like a bomb, and we could have stayed there forever as far as they were concerned, starved as they were for live entertainment. Officers and ratings alike rallied round and put on a great show. During the singing of our sexier solos, I was gratified to see some of our sailors looking hungrily at 50-year-old farmers' wives. Apparently even our kind of music had charms. The highest speed I ever achieved in a Corsair occurred at Nowra. I took a worn-out aircraft up to Bankstown, near Sydney, and returned with a new one. Flying the odd 80 miles back to Nowra, I saw from my watch that I would be hard put to it to arrive in time for lunch, and lunch in the mess was rather like the Sydney pubs. You had to be there when the come and get it. Call went out, otherwise you missed out completely. I arrived over the field at 18,000 feet. Hungry and thirsty, I dropped her into a vertical dive, took off the supercharger and let her go for Mother Earth. I was doing a hell of a speed. My circuit of the field was almost aerobatic as I put down wheels and flaps and did a quick landing. I reached the mess just in time and found myself sitting opposite Eddie Jess, leading navigator of our Avenger squadron. Eddie was a mathematician, obsessed with navigational problems, vectors and courses. "Who was that coming downhill in a hurry just now, Hans?" "Me," I replied. "You were going at a hell of a lick." He fished from his pocket his small air computer. "What height did you start your dive?" I told him. "Did you happen to notice your airspeed indicator?" Yes. I had seen exactly where the needle was during the fast drop to ground level. He muttered something about air temperature and did a bit of twiddling on the computer. He whistled through his teeth. "Yes, you were moving. I reckon you were going about 535 mil-lit. Quick, I would say." During our voyage to Sydney, I had been considerably impressed by the keenness of two of my young men, maintenance petty officers. A recent AFO had asked for volunteers from the ranks for flying training. No one yet knew of the atomic bomb, and we all thought the war against Japan would go on forever. These two boys had got wind of it and asked me to recommend them. As I say, I was impressed. Not that they were in any way unsuitable, far from it, in fact. But I would have thought that the hammering the air groups had taken at Palembang might well have made them think twice. Anyway, here they were, and I was prepared to back them to the hilt. "Has either of you flown at all?" They looked at one another. "No, sir." "Well, to begin with, are you sure you would like it? It isn't everybody's cup of tea, you know, and I would rather you didn't apply at all than volunteer and then find you hated it." I thought for a moment. I wasn't going to risk their lives with a first time off the deck in an Avenger whilst at sea. "Tell you what, when we reach Sydney, I'll find some way or other of getting you airborne. Then we will see how you feel about it." We hadn't been at Nowra a day before they reminded me of my promise. That evening I asked Nunnally if I might borrow a tiger moth on the following day to give these young men a short trip. I summoned them next morning and had them fitted out with parachutes and Gosport helmets. They were straining at the leash. Having given the first joy ride to the quieter boy, by the time I returned the other lad had worked up to a full head of steam. He almost wished the tiger off the ground, so keen was he to become airborne. I levelled off at 3,000 feet, and he immediately yelled down the voice pipe. "Will you do some stunts, sir? We certainly had a keen baby here." "What sort of stunts?" "Well, you know, sir, the lot. Will you please?" I told him to tighten his harness. Then I threw him around for a while. Rolls, chandelles, wing-overs. No sooner was I straight and level again. "You haven't done a loop yet, sir, bloody little glutton." "All right, here goes." As we came out of the first one, he whooped in sheer ecstasy. So I went straight into a second. As we recovered from that, "One more, sir, please." Throttle wide open, stick forward. Now back, and more right rudder. Now we're on the top and the engine has cut out. Let her fall again, cut the throttle and left rudder. The engine failed to cut in again. Height, 3,000 feet, no danger. Where to put her down? The airfield was on the port side, less than a mile away. "Okay." In strictly conversational tones, I said to him, "One of these days you might have to do a forced landing with no engine power. This is how you go about it." As I glided and S-turned down to the downwind end of the runway, I described every move I made. The prop, which had been gently windmilling, stopped rotating as I slowed down on my final turn to the runway. The grass and sand on either side was an unknown quantity for landing, and stuck there like a bit of bloody firewood. Then I received the shock of my life. Just turning onto the downwind leg was a mob of Avengers spacing themselves out with practiced precision for their landing, and here was I, about to flop down in the middle of the one and only runway. I put the moth onto the runway. In a flash I was out of my cockpit, undoing the boy's harness. "Out! Quick! Come on, for God's sake! Now get under that other tailplane and help me to push this contraption onto the sand." You can see I still loved tigers. As we dropped the tail skid into the sand, the first Avenger swept in, touching down abreast of us. We walked away to get out of the dust and the racket. The boy looked at me, uncomprehendingly. "But why didn't you taxi in, sir?" "No engine, son, no engine. It flaked out in that last loop. So that was a real forced landing." It was. When he had retrieved his lower jaw from the sand and had recovered his sang-froid, he became the squadron bore for a couple of days. I'm pretty certain that the squadron cooks, whose fascination with aircraft was about on a par with their interest in the sayings of Confucius, were left in no doubt at all that his very first flight had culminated in his very first forced landing. I put recommendations for them through to the captain, but I doubt very much if they ever saw another cockpit. For them, at least, the war would end too soon. Michael Tritton had received as replacement for Tiddles Brown, a new boy called Marrett, and one morning he asked me to take him out, mainly to run the rule over him in low flying. He was young, green, intelligent, and mad keen. But he was no low flyer as yet. Only practice would bring confidence and sure-footedness. When I took him below 30 feet, he shied like a young foal and bounced back up to 70 or 80 feet. He obviously had no affinity for Mother Earth. I took him up to 300 feet and had a quiet chat with him. Whilst 10 feet would probably see him safely home for lunch, 30 feet would undoubtedly get his head blown off. Close-range Japanese gunners were hot stuff, and aircraft flying at 30 to 60 feet above the ground were easy pickings. So let's try again. It didn't work. He had his limit, and that was that. As we buzzed along, rising and falling as we followed the contours of the sand dunes, I tried to assure him that, provided he stayed 2 or 3 feet above my wingtip, he would come to no harm. I myself had no intention of burrowing my way through a sand dune, and if I didn't, he wouldn't. Wasted words. I cajoled. I was encouraged. I swore like a leading stoker. But it was no use. He certainly wouldn't kill his chums, but his own life expectancy, particularly if he tried low flying, wasn't insurable. For the last time we were summoned to Sydney to be aboard by lunchtime. The Duke of Gloucester, Governor-General of Australia at that time, was to pay an official visit to his old friend Captain Lamb. The Duke circulated very cleverly, chatting for 6 or 7 minutes with each small group. He had just left us after a short conversation, during which we had found him to be extremely well informed on naval aviation, when one of his party joined us. For a week or two, our minds had been developing the idea that, when Illustrious sailed and we would join her outside Sydney Harbour, we would fly via Sydney in one beautiful, tight formation of 36 fighters and take the whole shebang under the famous bridge. We hadn't got around to thinking about possible repercussions. We would worry about them if and when we ever returned from the Pacific. We had done a fair amount of practice and were agreed that it would be a piece of cake. As I said, the Duke had just left us. An RAF group captain, drink in hand, strolled up to us. With no preliminaries whatsoever, he growled, "Don't you bloody do it!" We looked at one another. "Don't do what, sir?" said Michael with a pleasant smile. Groupie looked very hard. "You know bloody well what I mean. Try it and I'll court-martial all 36 of you, and that's no idle threat." He walked away. Who had talked? Ah, well, I had been too close for comfort to a court-martial in South Africa to seek an encore, and Michael was far too sensible to fly in the face of fortune. But it would have been banner headline stuff. We sailed on March 7th, and the air group landed without mishap. We had looked very longingly at Sydney Bridge. Flying was pretty limited as we drove north. During the next 6 or 7 days we did 1 or 2 exercise strikes. Not much, certainly, but sufficient to give us the feel of the deck again. Our course took us along the line of the Great Barrier Reef to the Coral Sea, thence northwards through the Louisiade archipelago, a myriad of small, brilliant green islands skirting New Guinea. Then we broke out into the Bismarck Sea and eventually reached Manus, chief of the Admiralty Islands, about 2 degrees south of the line. Here we rejoined the fleet, most of which had arrived on the day we had left Sydney. My God, it was hot. I took a bathing party ashore on the afternoon of our arrival. Not only was the sand unbearably hot on one's feet, but the temperature of the water was such that to swim was almost an impossibility, so completely was one's energy sapped. When I heard that the carrier, a quarter of a mile from the shore, was registering her water intake for the boilers at 85 degrees Fahrenheit, I wasn't the least bit surprised. Close to the beach we saw our hated enemies face to face for the first time. A barbed wire stockade stood within the palm trees. Inside this were hundreds of Japanese prisoners taken, presumably, during the recapture of this group of islands. Whilst we stood there, the Americans were unloading more of them across the open beach. They were taking no chances with these boys either, for each Japanese was securely shackled by chains, hand and foot, to ring bolts set in the decks of the small vessels transporting them. Some wore khaki shorts, most of them loincloths. Only a few had shoes or sandals. All of them looked thin, and their crew cuts only served to stress their gaunt appearance. They stood in groups, inscrutable, silent and wholly impassive. In the centre of a long, broad beach rose a great outcrop of rock, about 30 feet high and 30 feet square. A sickly, nauseating odour pervaded the whole area, and it was only when we had climbed this rocky eminence and found, running across its centre, a deep crevice in whose darkness we could just discern upturned shoes or boots with the telltale detached big-toe compartment, that we realised we had discovered the source. Japanese soldiers had fallen into the crack when shot dead, and their putrefying corpses were rendering paradise hideous with their disgusting gases. Now we were back in the tropics. Fresh water had to be rationed again. The intense heat drove us to showers and refreshing drinks, and 1,800 men, thirsty for anything wet, soon overloaded the system. The two evaporators could produce 140 to 160 tons of fresh water a day, but that was insufficient when temperatures were running well over the 100 mark. Our squadron office, immediately below the flight deck, regularly registered 127 degrees at midday. After 3 days we sailed, heading for the Carolines, and on March 20th anchored in Ulithi, inside the Great Coral Atoll. Someone said the atoll was well over 20 miles in length, and it seemed that every inch of it was occupied by ships of one kind or another, and mainly warships, both USN and RN. A 30-knot wind blew across it night and day. What a hell of a place. I thought of boyhood reading and R.M. Ballantyne's The Coral Island. It wasn't like this at all. It was our last chance for a conference before we went into battle again. Aboard Indomitable, Vian's Chief of Staff, Captain Wright, conducted a meeting in the early part of a hot afternoon. After 1 hour precisely, the door opened and Vian came in, tall, erect, slim-figured, and with his pale blue eyes alert and quicksilver. He strode smartly to the side of his Chief of Staff. "All right, Wright," he said, loud and clear. "If we can't organise the thing in an hour, it's not worth doing." There was a pause as those searching eyes, surmounted by heavy eyebrows, surveyed the officers who fairly filled the wardroom. "Stand up the flying, boys!" The COs of the many squadrons rose to their feet. "I've a short message. No, don't bother taking notes. It's only 4 words, for you to take back to your air crews. Get bloody stuck in. Any more questions? Right, and the best of luck to all of you." We were soon to learn that he was well worth getting bloody stuck in for. On March 23rd, the British Pacific Fleet, in all its might and majesty, sailed from Ulithi for the new theatre of war. The bureaucratic side of the Navy, which no doubt directed our destinies, but beyond that, appeared to our lowly eyes to leave us otherwise uninvolved, had been busy. The US Navy in Washington had never been over-anxious to see the Royal Navy in the Pacific Ocean. Moves and counter-moves had been made whilst we were chewing straws at Naura, or swinging to buoys in Manus and Ulithi, and eventually the decision had been taken. The US Navy's Pacific Fleet, under the command of Admiral Chester Nimitz and his Deputy Admiral Raymond Spruance, was now poised to launch Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, possession of which would give the US Air Force's airfields from which to attack the mainland of Japan itself. The direction in which the energies of the British Pacific Fleet should be channeled had long been the subject of controversy, at times acrimonious, between the US and British governments. On March 14th, however, the diplomatic skies cleared at last, and the British Pacific Fleet received a signal directing it to report for duty to Admiral Nimitz. So the fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Sir H.B. Rawlings, now became Task Force 57, to work alongside the Americans' fast carrier force, Admiral Mitcher, both under the direct command of Admiral Spruance. This officer ordained that the neutralization of the 3 islands of the Sakishima Gunto, Miyako, Ishigaki, and Iriomote, should be our responsibility. Their importance in the coming battle lay in the fact that all 3 possessed airfields. When the fury of the U.S. fleet's air attacks fell upon Okinawa, the enemy's hopes of replenishing their supply of aircraft would lie only in staging them from China, through Formosa and the Sakishima Islands group. It was hoped that our operations would render this impossible, or at the least extremely hazardous and uncertain. The Fleet Air Arm was now to embark upon a war of attrition in which, like all toe-to-toe slogging matches, there was to be neither glamour or spectacle. It was to be sheer drudgery, with a heavy price to be paid for a result which would never be assessed with even a moderate degree of accuracy. The passage of 30 years has blunted for me many of the details of our part in that seemingly endless battle. Of the 4 carriers which took the fight to the enemy that day, illustrious was the weary one, for we had endured life in the tropics longer than most, and strain and tiredness were now to be seen in the faces of the air crews. We were becoming worn and twitchy. To seek an early night's sleep just didn't seem to work. One flew round the cabin, dodging the flak, practicing a landing for the first 2 hours, and if sleep eventually came, only 3 hours or so of fitful rest remained before a shake from the duty boy brought one reluctantly to the dark, cold beginning of another day. Breakfast had always been a cheering time with plenty of wisecracking and laughter. Now it was a silent feast of too little food and too many cups of coffee and cigarettes, and a significant absence of chatter. The losses and prangs we suffered now had a telling effect. Where our pilots in earlier days had produced resilience and courage, which seemed automatic to recover quickly from their own accidents, or crashes or death involving their friends, the losses were now hard to bear and brought dejection and fretfulness. Their natural ebullience retreated and left them thoughtful and introspective. Tiredness brought lethargy and carelessness to their flying. Some of the landing approaches and landings themselves were hideous to behold, and to watch them was a nightmare few could endure for more than minutes at a time. Yet through it all, youth and the rich instinct born of sound training could still find a crack to burst through, to express themselves in a bright flash of repartee and fun. And every day produced a fresh crop of incidents which, tragic or dangerous though some of them might be, at least sent the adrenaline pumping through, strongly and excitedly, and restored the boys, even briefly, to their old excellence and brilliance. Despite the tiredness, Operation Iceberg brought out some of the best in us, even though the life we now led was something which, like a penetrating fluid, searched out, exposed, and exploited that tiredness. The captain, commander flying, and the navigator rarely left the island during the whole operation. The day's work began at 0330 when air crews, squadron ratings, and flight deck parties were roused. Between 0430 and 0500, the ship closed up to action stations in readiness for suicide attacks, for we were now in kamikaze territory. All guns' crews closed up. All watertight doors were secured, which meant that for most of the officers their cabins were barred to them. The ventilating fans were shut down, causing the inside of the ship to become airless and, as the day wore on, decidedly smelly. Food consisted of bully beef sandwiches and endless tea, typical action stations rations. So we were thrown out of our cabins, usually at the last moment, and if you were unwise enough to snatch those last few precious minutes, unwashed and unshaven, some chaps in a fine "oh, sod it" spirit shunned ablutions, even breakfast, and flew all day in their pyjamas against the empire of the rising sun. Most of us went along for some sort of breakfast. Those on the early shift, so to speak, then made their way to the air operations room, some to remain there on standby, the remainder to grab their helmets and May Wests and go out to the flight deck in the cold of a pre-dawn morning to climb into their corsairs and sit and shiver. In the meantime, Colin Cunningham and John Hastings were checking and spotting the aircraft for takeoff, most of which duty had been carried out the previous evening. At 0600, the first standing patrols took off, followed quickly by the first mixed striking force of the day, the Avengers to bomb the runways on the 3 islands, the fighters to shoot up any aircraft they could find and stand guard over the bombers. With the first launch out of the way, more Corsairs were ranged at readiness, to be scrambled immediately should the enemy appear on the radar screens. As soon as the early strike was seen to be returning, Corsairs flew off to continue the patrols over the islands. This was usually a 3-hour stint, with the patrols being replaced at regular intervals until darkness fell. The ship remained at a state of readiness throughout the day, conditioned by 3 stages of air raid warnings: yellow, blue, and red, which demanded for the fighters standby, readiness, and scramble in that order. So the day wore on, takeoffs and landings at regular intervals, requiring the fleet to turn into wind on each occasion. And how the destroyers loved this. It provided for them a refreshing change from their faithful zigzagging and Azdic watch, which they pursued zealously and endlessly. For suddenly they were required to reform their screen as quickly as possible, which gave them the chance to show their paces by romping through the fleet at a rate of knots, with no end of panache and exhibitionism. In the late afternoon, a strike of Avengers took off for one more attack on the airfields, to pound once again all the landing strips just before darkness fell. This made it difficult for the Japanese to do any repairs to them that day, thus rendering it hazardous for night landings to be made by aircraft hopeful of staging through from Formosa to Okinawa. On morning patrols we often saw crashed aircraft which had fallen foul of some crater, obviously having attempted to do just that. At dusk, when all our aircraft had returned, they were serviced, refueled, and rearmed against the next day's operations. Those which were unserviceable were set upon by the weary fitters and riggers, who would work all the night through, if needs be, to get them back into fighting trim. We were, of course, still burdened with our deck park of 14 aircraft, which could be neither refueled nor rearmed until the next morning. In that condition, they could not possibly be set on fire by a night suicide attack. When the COs of the squadrons and their maintenance chiefs had finalized their Mayfly lists, aircraft serviceable to fly on the morrow, the first take-off of the day was decided upon. Then the hangar parties set to work, ranging the allotted aircraft onto the lifts and up to the flight deck, where the deck parties would spot the Avengers and Corsairs in the correct positions for the next morning's take-off. This chore could keep these grand chaps hard at work until 9 or 10 o'clock at night. Blessed relief from action stations came with nightfall. Cabins were once again accessible, and one could indulge in a shower and a change of clothing from the everlasting flying overalls, grimy and dank with perspiration. Full ventilation was resumed, and at long last a substantial meal was available. A quick beer, then off to bed. These were no nights for sing-songs. For 3 days on end this was our existence. Late on the 3rd afternoon, the fleet turned away from the operational area, and after a hard night's steaming, rendezvoused next morning with the fleet train, a great supply fleet with its main base in Sydney and a forward one at Manus. For 40 hours we cruised together at low speed. Tankers were there to top up every ship. Aviation Spirit tankers brought the lifeblood for the aircraft. Escort carriers were there with replacement aircraft and pilots. And for all of us, ammunition and supply ships with everything else we required, especially food and mail. As far as possible, the fleet relaxed and rested. Frigates and sloops of the fleet train maintained anti-submarine patrols. Fighters from the escort carriers patrolled all the hours of daylight over the vast conglomeration of ships. On the evening of the 2nd day we parted company. Again we steamed hard for the iceberg area, and by dawn we were once more fit and ready for the fray, for another 3-day routine. This was the pattern of all our lives. Our battles with the enemy on the Sakishima Gunto started on March 26th, and for the first time we fell upon the airfields of Miyako, Ishigaki, and Iriomote. The old firm of Illustrious and Victorious suffered disaster almost immediately. One of our Avengers was shot down with the loss of the 3 crewmen, and Vic's Chris Tompkinson, Colorado of 1836 Corsair Squadron, failed to return from the islands. Flak was the great leveller. It could send to a sudden, flashing death the experienced and the sprog alike, and Chris was regarded as a good, safe hand, a great pilot with many, many hours under his belt. My logbook tells me that my flight was over Ishigaki next morning, where we destroyed a twin-engined aircraft. It also says that we were lucky enough to get in and out with a minimum of fuss. That type was what we all hoped to find. In the first attack of the following day, our new Avenger CO, Freddie Nottingham from Johannesburg, was hit over the runway at Hirara on the island of Miyako, setting on fire the starboard wing. He promptly dropped his bombs, turned in a flash, and dived steeply out to sea, successfully extinguishing the fire. However, he had little or no time to congratulate himself on his success, for, without the slightest warning, the starboard wing broke off at the roots, and the Avenger, at no more than 2,000 to 3,000 feet, spiraled towards the sea. Freddie yelled to his crew to bail out, waited for a few seconds, then hit the silk himself. He landed safely in the water and was aboard his dinghy in quick time, but the escape-in-a-hurry exit of the Avenger was not very easy, particularly when the aircraft was falling at one hell of an angle, and his navigator and air gunner died with the aircraft. Nottingham saw them die and resigned himself to whatever fate awaited him. An Avenger from Indomitable, on his way back from the same island, saw the dinghy and circled low, transmitting a continuous mayday signal. No one acknowledged his call, nor did anyone turn up to relieve him. Inevitably, running short of fuel, he had to leave the scene. What with landing on, debriefing, and all the excitement that fairly bubbles over after an operational sortie, it wasn't until sometime after 1100 that he remembered the dinghy. He rushed to his commander, operations, and reported it. Despite the fact that the fleet was now heading south away from Sakishima and towards the rendezvous with the fleet train, Admiral Vian, ready as always to pull out all the stops to rescue one of his flyers, detached a destroyer to go back to search the estimated area. Not long afterwards, an American air-sea rescue submarine, Kingfish, came up on the Admiral's wavelength. She had heard something of the exchange of signals. She wasn't too far from the reported position. Could she do anything to assist? She was given such information as was available, scanty enough, and thanked for her assistance. Around 1330, the flagship signalled us to say that the submarine had been on the air again. According to her reckoning, the dinghy must be somewhere 9 or 10 miles south of Miyako. As she had to search on the surface, she would need fighter cover. It was our man in the drink, said the Admiral's staff, so it was from Illustrious that the fighters should be dispatched. At 1400, my flight took off and headed back towards Miyako. We hadn't gone far before I saw the destroyer which had been sent back. She was far away on my port side and on an entirely different course. I had checked mine with Ian Steele, our navigator, and Ian was never wrong. Was Undine, for that was the destroyer commanded by Commander T.C. Robinson, DSC RN, as I was to discover later, wrong? I rang her up and suggested she might be. Not surprisingly, her reply was a bit terse. After all, the navigational capability of fighter pilots was as huge a joke to the fleet as their ability to interpret the flashings of a signalling lamp. In measured, polite terms, she said she would go her own way, thank you. The destroyer never came within miles of Freddie, but she did nearly run down another dinghy. When they had rescued the inmate, they found him to be an American fighter pilot who had been shot down off Okinawa, some 40 to 50 miles further north, 2 or 3 days before. How lucky can you be? Yet I was the one who was wrong and Undine right, for I had sadly misjudged her. Too late to be apologetic about it, I found later that there had been no cause to question her course, for she was on her way to pick up Doc Stewart, Indomitable's bomber wing leader, and his crew, who had also had the misfortune to ditch that morning. But I hadn't been told that a double rescue was afoot, and I have never been clever enough to refrain from interfering in other people's affairs. Hours were to elapse before Freddie Nottingham was found. My thoughts were interrupted by an RT call, so strong it nearly blew my helmet off. It was the Kingfish to tell me that she was over to port from me, and when I scanned carefully from 10,000 feet, there was her wake, 5 or 6 miles away. She was on the surface and going like a bomb, a big job too, and she looked great. As we went up to her to have a chat, the clouds were gathering over the Gonto, and I didn't see much danger of an attack. My own estimate, with which she agreed, was that we were still some considerable distance west of the probable position, and I said that we would fly searches ahead of her, a section at a time. Numbers 3 and 4 led off, while number 2 and myself remained around 7,000 feet to give us room for manoeuvre in the event of some Japanese soldier trying his hand. The boys came back in 20 minutes, no joy. So Jimmy and I set out. Now we had to drop down, for dinghies are difficult to find from the air. It's even harder if you're looking for a head surrounded by a Mae West collar, and we had no guarantee that Freddie was still in his dinghy. We were scudding along at 50 feet, engaged in what I hoped was a fair imitation of a square search, something at which navigators are expert, but which to a fighter pilot is a closed book. Anyway, we roamed the empty seas for half an hour without success. We toiled on through the long afternoon, running on a very lean mixture and coarse pitch to give us maximum endurance. We had long since exhausted our belly tanks. The submarine and I kept up a commentary until, about 16:30, we decided we were well inside the area. Still nothing showed up, and still we went on searching. The submarine was now engaged in some search pattern of her own, and we were combing a pretty big area around her. Around 17:45, I started to have dreams of home. I hadn't the faintest idea where the fleet would be, other than that they were somewhere to the south. As to how many miles away, I couldn't even begin to guess, and it would be dark by 1900 to 1930. I didn't fancy a night landing for some of the new boys, or for myself. Corsairs could kill us quite effortlessly in broad daylight, without any assistance from the darkness. So at 1800 I called up my American friend and told him I thought we should be heading south. A pity, he said, for he felt we were so near. Could I possibly stretch it to 1815? I looked around at my pilots, who were listening, of course, thinking of their lives and realizing that they would automatically leave the whole thing to me. And then I thought of Freddie Nottingham, out there on the darkening sea. "Okay, 15 minutes. There's little danger of any interference now, so we'll send out 3 and I'll keep guard myself. Out." The boys tore off again into the gloom to the east. They were scarcely out of sight before I saw a red star rise from the water down to the south. The submarine saw it at the same time, and her wake described a great arc of silver as she put her wheel hard a-starboard. I recalled the other pilots and, diving down to water level, flew past the dinghy at 10 feet. Freddie was waving his little flag like a madman. Great stuff. We waited until the submarine came down to him, 2 ratings in swimming trunks already out on the outer casing. As she hove to with a frenzied flurry in her wake, they jumped, tied to the ends of lifelines, to help Nottingham onto the casing. After a minute or two, the commander came on the air. "The pilot's name is Nottingham. I repeat, Nottingham." I can't remember now what I said. There was a burst of mutual thanking and metaphorical backslapping. We wished each other Godspeed and went on our ways. It must be said here that Nottingham had shown himself to be extremely cool and remarkably courageous. He had only 3 small rockets in his Mae West, little more than Roman candles, and although he had watched us for more than a couple of hours, searching to the north of him, he had withstood the temptation to fire them, knowing full well that we would be unlikely to see them whilst the light remained good. Only when dusk fell did he let go the first one, and we saw it. Freddie the Unflappable. Now the rescue was achieved, it was, "Home, James!" We roared off to the south, climbing like dingbats for altitude in order to establish radio contact. We were up to 16,000 feet before I got a reply. Then Indomitable, with the best radio in the fleet, came up loud and clear. She told me not to waste time giving her a fix, just to press on and await their call when we appeared on radar. Some time later, the FDO was back. "Now we've got you, 80 miles to go. Turn 10 degrees to port onto 175 degrees. Over." I thanked him. I was a lot happier now, and could almost hear the boys whistling with good cheer. We were still up in the mellow light of an orange setting sun with the sea, far below us, as black as ink. The minutes ticked away. 25 to go. Time passed. "We're down on your port side now. Can you see us? Over." I looked down, at an angle of some 45 degrees. Nothing. Not yet. Over. Good God, man! You're looking down the bloody chimney. Look again. Over. Yes, they were there. When I had lost some altitude and done a couple of circuits to accustom myself to the comparative darkness, I now saw the faint white smudges which only delicately relieved the leaden gloom of the sea. We did the rounds of the carriers to find Illustrious, putting on navigation lights for the benefit of Colin Cunningham, who was doing the batting. In fact, by the time we had flown our pattern, we could see reasonably well, and landing was no problem. Nottingham was taken by his submarine to Saipan, and in the course of a day or two, Admiral Nimitz, USN C&C Pacific, had him flown to Leyte in the Philippines in his personal aircraft. The suicide bombers came at us out of Formosa. Despite their fanatical courage and determination, the battle was by no means one-sided. On April 1st, Victorious was attacked by one whose approach was spectacular, even if the end result was disappointing for him. This son of the divine wind passed over Vic at a considerable altitude, did a half-roll and then pulled into a vertical dive. Captain Denny judged matters to a nicety. When the Japanese pilot was fully committed to his dive, with his ailerons good and frozen, he gave a helm order to port, and the horrible little man plunged into the Pacific only yards from the starboard bow. Earlier in the day, 2 kamikazes had been more successful. At first light, as we were out on the flight deck supervising the first takeoff, there was the scream of a diving aircraft passing over us. The hell of a bang followed as a suicider slammed into Indefatigable, sailing parallel to us about 300 yards on our starboard side. She took the blow in the worst possible place, in the angle between flight deck and island, and casualties in dead, wounded and missing were heavy. The armour-plated deck protected the hangar from damage, but itself suffered a severe dent from the sheer impact. Ingenuity, however, is only one of the many arts of which a Royal Naval ship is mistress. Quick-drying cement was poured into the depression and levelled off. Within a few short hours, Indefat was operating her aircraft, as though she had experienced nothing more than a slight hiccup. Ulster, one of our fine destroyers, took a kamikaze on the same day, with tragic results. This little man must have heard about armoured decks on carriers and had decided to take on easier meat. He came steep and fast from the port beam and drove his aircraft, or his bomb, I never knew which, through Ulster's iron deck into the port boiler room. Above the gaping hole leading into the inferno below sat a Bofors gunner, who must have been a cool customer, for within seconds of the explosion he shot down a second kamikaze which was following the first. Poor Ulster. She was stopped in her tracks, sorely stricken but by no means lost. Gambia took her in tow and evacuated her safely from the danger area. The days passed, patrol after patrol. Sometimes morning, sometimes afternoon or evening, often all three. We became tired, we lost appetites. There was no time for laundry to be done, and our flying overalls became sweat-sodden and dirty. They were long flying days, punctuated by brief, flashing moments of excitement, fear and heart-stopping flap. The enemy had a seemingly endless supply of flak ammunition, and the more aircraft we flew over his islands, the better his practice became. We drove ourselves to attack him through all the hours of daylight, and he never failed to greet us with his withering fire of deceptively slow climbing balls of red and green as the flak rose to bracket us. Apart from the ever-present menace of the enemy, we occasionally manufactured a few problems for ourselves. As we flew our landing pattern one afternoon, a panic call about kamikazes in the vicinity of the fleet alerted us. Right on its heels came an order to get the hell out of it and to give full bore on an interception course. I tucked up wheels and flaps, gave it the gun and went into a fast climb to the west, at the same time turning on my gun switches. 6 of them with a master switch, situated immediately below the windscreen. We must have been about 8,000 feet when the recall came. Some Charlie had approached the fleet not showing his IFF. Coming in to land for the second time, I was clueless enough to forget to flick off the gun switches. Having taxied up to the forward round down, switched off the engine and unharnessed myself, I heaved myself up to get out of the cockpit, pulling on the joystick with my right hand for a bit of assistance. My 6 guns roared out with a fine, uninhibited 2-second burst. A destroyer keeping station on us 2 cables ahead promptly turned up the taps and proceeded to belt off at high speed in the general direction of Australia. I didn't blame her for one moment. A seemingly endless succession of chunks of armour-piercing steel, 1/2 inch in diameter and about 2 inches long, scudding smartly above one's head, is sufficient encouragement to push off for any destination, even Australia. I walked down the flight deck, wearing as nonchalant an expression as I could muster. But I couldn't fool Captain Lamb. As I passed close beneath the flying bridge, trying to avoid attention, I heard Hans, in unusually soft tones. I looked up. His face bore the suspicion of a grin, and his right index finger beckoned me. He listened to my feeble excuse without interruption. Then, "I'm sure it's easily done, Hans. Probably too easily on a day like this has been. But you know, you really shouldn't frighten people like that." I knew, as he did, that I could easily have killed some of our side. But he knew that I knew, and he was great enough to resist delivering clichés. One evening, a young new pilot came into my cabin. He was just out from England and had come up with the fleet train. I had a chat with him and tried to make him feel at home, a pleasant kid, cheerful and as keen as mustard. As he turned to go, he hesitated for a moment and said, "Did you say your name was Hanson, sir?" I nodded. "Did you by any chance go to Pensacola, sir?" "Yes, I had trained there. Do you know they're still talking about you?" "Well," I said, "that's very nice of them. As a matter of fact, I played the organ there for about 6 months and thoroughly enjoyed myself." "Oh, I didn't know about that." "No, it's about the decompression chamber there. The surgeon commander told us to be human, or natural, I can't remember which, but certainly not to behave like another limey called Hanson who had done the job with maximum marks, the only one ever. Was that you, sir?" He grinned. "He doesn't seem to have got over it." "It's true, for what it's worth, but I'm a bit surprised he still talks about it. If he's still there, and from what you say there's a fair chance that he is, I would have thought he would have learnt to do it himself. Anyway, the hell with history. Come on for a drink and I'll introduce you to the boys. You'll be flying in my flight." I have said that our long spell in the tropics was now beginning to take its toll. Victorious, our chummy ship, was much fresher. Where some months earlier we had been able to beat them decisively to the draw where launching and landing were concerned, they now had the edge on us. In an endeavour to show Vic that we were still a force to be reckoned with, Wings launched us one day a little prematurely, before the ship was fully turned into the wind. Illustrious was still wheeling quickly into wind with starboard helm when I rolled up the deck. As I passed the island and became exposed to the full force of the breeze blowing from the starboard side, it caught me completely unawares and carried me fiercely to port. The port wheel mounted the forward 4.5-inch turret. There was a big bang, and I almost half rolled into the sea. The bang, I discovered later, was the impact of my port flaps on a stout metal stanchion standing about 3 feet high, at the very corner of the deck. With the stick hard over to starboard, a lot of praying, sheer willpower, and one hell of a lot of luck, I scraped the Corsair off the water, leaving a wake like that of a motorboat, and struggled into the air. I was relieved when, having reached sufficient height to retract undercarriage and flaps, I found that she flew perfectly well. For 3 solid hours, off and on, I worried about the landing to come. Half an hour before we were due to land, I handed over command of the flight to Johnny Baker and pushed off to a large cumulus cloud which was sailing serenely on its way to Hawaii. Using it as a flight deck, I made my approach. Wheels down, okay. Flaps down, frightening. Again the aircraft rolled off to port. I looked down at the flaps as best I could. The inboard section was just below halfway down. The outward section was only very slightly down. With only partial lift on that side, the lift on the starboard side was too strong. So I went round again, this time using only half flap. The effect was not nearly so scaring, but my landing speed had to be much higher. I put on full throttle to test the effect in case I had to take a wave off. I went into an awkward, half-sideways roll that was violent enough to shake me rigid. Just before we started the descent from 10,000 feet, I called Baker over. "Johnny, I've got a problem. Come underneath me. Stick your head in the wheel well and tell me what the hell has gone." He came close beneath me. There weren't many pilots I would have allowed to come as close to me as that, and after 30 seconds he emerged and came alongside. "Is the undercarriage damaged, Johnny? I know the flaps are buggered." "Undercart, okay. The jack on the port flaps is broken and you are losing all your fluid. The metal of the flaps is badly torn. Clumsy sod, aren't you, sir?" Big grin from the cockpit. "But your undercart is definitely okay. Tyres look fine too, no sign of a burst." As we dropped down to the ship, I called Johnny Hastings to the FDO's radio. I told him I had problems and had been trying some ADDLs on one of the local clouds. I would have to land fairly fast and straight, no screaming turn, for I couldn't take a wave off. It would have to be a first-time effort. While the other boys were landing on, the ship came on the RT again. The captain gave me 3 alternatives: a landing, bail out or ditch, and I had to make up my mind quickly. I didn't hesitate. I would go for the landing. When the other aircraft were safely out of harm's way, the fire hoses were run out on deck, and I could see the firefighters donning their asbestos suits. I gulped once or twice. It was a daunting moment. Then, "Right! Come on in!" I went into my landing pattern. On the last turn towards the ship, I tentatively tried the flaps, still that tendency to roll out of my hands, and my stall warning light flickered ominously. I'd gone in on this corner before, and I wasn't keen to do an encore. I put on a bit more urge, 88 knots, and kept it there. As I approached from something like 15 degrees from the fore and aft line, Johnny gave me, "You're fast." Sod that, I thought. You'll just have to like it, John. He brought me down, 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 still saying I was fast. Then he cut me, and with still a lot of right stick, I chopped the throttle. Christ, the wires were flying beneath me. A dirty Great Barrier looms up in front, so this is what it's like. Then my head was practically jerked from my neck. I had caught the last wire, for the very best of reasons known as the Jesus Christ. Over the tannoy I heard Wings say something at once friendly and pleasantly vulgar. Home again in one piece. 2 sections of flap and a new jack were replaced within a couple of hours. Certainly a damn sight faster than I recovered. The appearance on the radar screens of suicide aircraft galvanized the whole fleet into activity. Airborne fighters were vectored towards incoming enemy aircraft, and fighters at readiness were launched. Very good interceptions were made as far away as 20 to 30 miles from the fleet. Invariably, the enemy chose weather which was partially overcast. They were expert at cloud dodging, an art which occasionally reduced the serious business of war to a game of cowboys and Indians. There was one morning when 2 of our fighters caught a Japanese pilot on the hop, far away from the fleet, who elected to seek safety inside a large cumulus. We posted buoys all around the cloud, and above and below it, and awaited developments. The impatient Churchill, however, dashed into the cloud, and in no time at all emerged on the far side, there to see his enemy only a matter of yards away from him. The Japanese was quickly dispatched. Other moments, too, were reminiscent of Laurel and Hardy. Mike Tritton and I were on standby one sultry afternoon when a red warning came up. We hurtled down the ladder and out onto the after-flight deck, where we leapt into the first 2 Corsairs we reached. Other pilots were running behind us to clear the deck of aircraft. Mike took off very quickly indeed, closely followed by me. My choice didn't sound very happy. She was running very roughly and only just staggered off the deck. This was going to be a great flight. I could hear Mike being vectored towards the enemy as I pulled up the undercarriage and went into a tight turn to form up on him. As I put on the power, however, nothing happened apart from the hell of a lot of banging up front. It sounded as though the engine was about to leave its bearers. As Michael faded rapidly into the distance, I abandoned all hope of becoming an effective part of the defence and turned for the carrier, yelling at her as I did so to keep her into wind. I couldn't see this old cattle truck staying airborne for much longer, and I wanted an emergency landing, badly. As I jumped to the deck after parking up forward, Wolf Madison, our squadron maintenance chief, a wizard with aero engines if ever there was one, was waiting for me. He looked a bit sorrowful. "You shouldn't have taken that one, you know, sir," he said. in the manner of a kindly though somewhat morose farmer delivering a homily to a schoolboy caught in the act of stealing apples. "She's waiting for a plug change and isn't fit to fly." He scratched his ear and surveyed the deck with the look of a man who had been indulging in some heart-searching. "It's been a bloody awful afternoon altogether, really. I tested the engine of this thing right after dinner, and we still haven't been able to use the lift to get her below. That's why she's still here." I stared at him, open-mouthed. "Can't understand what you're moaning at, Chief. I can tell you she isn't safe, not even to go shopping with. But if you will leave your rubbish lying around the deck, I didn't know she was unserviceable when I jumped into her. You want to be careful in these dangerous times, Wolf. You might have been shot off in the thing yourself. At least you could have done the plug change while you were at it." When the Japanese ships came within range of the fleet's guns, the atmosphere was like a Wembley Cup final, with goofers on all sides urging the gunners to get the bastards, for Christ's sake. No one was under any delusion. Once a suicide attacker penetrated the patrols and reached a position 5 or 6 miles from the fleet, there was only one end. He was coming in. Nothing, apart from being blown apart, would stop him now. The toiling crews of the 4.5-inch guns were execrated in appalling language when their shells burst wide of the mark. If the screaming Zeke were shot out of the sky, the cheering was ecstatic, a goal in any man's language. We had tragedies. 2 Seafires from Indefatigable, hell-bent on finishing off their prey, followed Zeeks into the fleet's field of fire and paid the awful penalty. It was psychologically difficult to break off when you had him cold in your sights. In an endeavour to avoid such unnecessary loss of life, orders were issued that aircraft returning to the fleet while it was still trigger-happy following an attack, and who shall blame them for being so, should approach sedately in regular formation and with undercarriages lowered. One afternoon our flight returned in copybook formation, wheels down, as though flying past Buckingham Palace on a Sunday afternoon, when we were greeted with a salvo from Howe's secondary armament of 5.25-inch guns. A fine welcome indeed. My language over the RT was blistering and obscene. However, I was greatly mollified, first by the fact that their practice was poor and missed us by the length of Piccadilly, and even more so when I received an immediate apology, couched in much more gentlemanly and decorous terms. The manners of the Dartmouth boys, even under heavy stress, were impeccable. The flying was fast and furious. 2 or 3 days later, whilst patrolling over the fleet, we were given a vector to intercept which spoke volumes for the efficiency of the radar operators and fighter direction team, for we must have been 20 miles away when we saw them, 4 Zeeks in straggling formation, heading straight for us and about 1,000 feet above. As we sounded the tally-ho, they broke formation and scattered to the 4 winds. 2 of them, for some reason or other, headed south, and I heard later that they had been intercepted and shot down by some of Vic's corsairs. The other 2 turned 180 degrees and opened up the taps for home. We gave chase, but they had at least a couple of miles head start, and even with our superior speed, it would take some time to overhaul them. I bent the throttle lever and prayed that we would catch them before we had to land at Pekin to refuel. Suddenly, Jerry Salmon came up. Jerry was one of Michael's boys. We were flying a mixed flight on that trip. "Can we use the water injection, boss?" Good God, of course. The machine I was flying, not my own, which was being serviced, was not equipped with water injection, and the idea had never entered my thick head. "Yes, Jerry! Bang it in and go get 'em!" The 3 aircraft shot away from me as though I was going astern. I throttled back a little to ease my panting engine and watched the fun and games up ahead. Both enemy aircraft were quickly shot down. By now we were enlarging our capabilities by attacking the enemy in the fighter-bomber role. Since the Japanese had been obliged to concentrate on suicide tactics, interference by interceptor fighters was non-existent, and we could afford to increase our attacking tactics. The Corsair could carry quite comfortably 2 500-pound bombs, attached to racks fitted to the centre section of the wings, and with these we helped the Avengers to devastate the runways. We also used napalm bombs, which were frighteningly effective on airfield buildings and barrack blocks. Napalm cartridges, inserted into our overload belly tanks, were actuated from the cockpit a few minutes before dropping on the targets, and the instantaneous carpet of fire which enveloped a large area as soon as the tank hit. The earth was almost sickening to see from the air, a truly dreadful weapon. Our accuracy with the conventional bombs probably wasn't as professional as that of our Avenger friends, but if you can't hit a runway, there's something seriously amiss with your eyesight. Tiredness, probably the greatest enemy with which we had to contend, was now showing itself quite blatantly. Bruce McLaren made a desperate attempt to land, which was nothing less than a dive-bombing attack on the deck. Everything about it was wrong. He was too fast, too high, and his approach had been diabolical. He thumped into the deck with his main wheels, bounced clean over both barriers, and tried to stuff his nose down into the foredeck. Had he succeeded, he would have destroyed himself and 5 or 6 aircraft parked in the bows. Fortunately for all of us, his starboard wing clipped the boom of the mobile crane parked forward of the island, which slewed him round to starboard and shot him into the sea. He had the good sense to wait until he hit the water before releasing himself from the cockpit and was safely picked up by a destroyer. Certainly he never flew from the carrier again. Where deck landing was concerned, Bruce had reached the pitch where Bob Ellison had to put his foot down. That immaculate flyer, Percy Cole, was also tiring. In the course of 3 or 4 days, he endured 2 very bad barrier crashes, from both of which he was lucky to escape unhurt. In one of them, certainly, he admitted that he had forgotten to close the throttle. Jimmy James, my RN lieutenant, stalled in the middle of his downwind leg run to the carrier. There was no good reason why he should have done so. His lack of attention, resulting from tiredness, allowed his aircraft to fall below flying speed. He crashed into the sea from 500 feet and escaped with a broken arm. Most of us began to suffer from off days, dreadful mornings when our normal relaxed attitude to flying was nowhere to be seen, days when the very thought of making low-flying attacks was positive anathema. I recall one morning when we were flying the first patrol of the day over Ishigaki, whose short-range flak was by now notorious for its deadly accuracy. From 10,000 feet, scanning the airfield through my binoculars, I saw 3 aircraft, or dummies. Even with an excellent pair of glasses, it wasn't always possible to distinguish between them. 2 were in revetments, the other on the grass 50 yards from the strip. Small boards, with a bulldog clip holding plans of the airfields, were strapped to our thighs, and I duly penciled in the planes in their correct positions. When we landed much later, I went to see the I.O. and handed him the chart. 3 there for you, my old cock-sparrow. You can put the bombers onto them. He obviously hadn't heard or noticed the last sentence. He was busily writing up his cumulative report. Hans, 3 aircraft, Ishigaki. He looked up at me. Destroyed? Not even scratched. As I said, put the bombers onto them. He stroked his chin with his pencil. But you had a go, surely. Look, I said impatiently, I don't have to explain to you what I did or why I did it. All I have to tell you is what I saw. But why not, Hans? Balls to explanations. I've given you the dope. Now it's all yours. I felt touchy and irritable, annoyed with myself for my gloomy premonitions and irritated by his persistence. 2 days later we were over the same field. Today was different. I was different. My Corsair was once again a part of me, not just a machine I was driving across the sky. I could have put her through the eye of a needle. My binoculars showed me what could be a juicy myrtle at the end of the runway. We came down from 10,000 feet and did a fast run across the field at about 5,000 feet. This was no dummy, for there was quite a gaggle of Japanese soldiers buzzing about her. As we disappeared out to sea, I sized up the situation and turned to Baker. On a job like this he was invaluable, intelligent and courageous. "You saw her, Johnny?" He nodded. "Trouble is, the guns are right behind her. I want you to do a dummy attack from the east when I tell you. Make it look really good." He knew what I wanted. He didn't even reply. When he had heard me out, he gave me the 0 sign with finger and thumb. I wheeled away from them and climbed out to the west. When I had got myself organized, I went on the RT again. "Tell me when you're all set, John. Start from about 3 miles out. Okay, wait. Seconds passed. All set. Say when. I lined myself up on the runway from way out and took the compass bearing. Now! Go! I rocketed down from 10,000 feet, tearing a great strip down the sky. As I crossed the coast, I was low down, cracking along at 300 knots. I knew exactly where the Myrtle was. I was lined up on her, well out of range, when I saw Johnny and his boys steaming down in a great fast arc, drawing, it seemed to me, all the flak north of the equator. Then I was there. I opened up at long range and saw Tracer going straight into the Myrtle. There were ladders up against the engines. They were putting new props on her. She must have nosed over on landing. Now I was really hitting her. Men, ladders, chunks of metal were flying all over the place. Something like a miniature explosion blew up when the cone of my gun pattern hit her. There were flashes from ricocheting Tracer around me as I pulled over the aircraft and dropped down again to flat hat out to sea. They had been so engrossed with Johnny's attack that I doubt if they knew I was there until it was all over. We had been patrolling over the fleet at 25,000 feet for 2.5 hours. Life was becoming a bit tedious, and our rear ends were beginning to notice what uncomfortable cushions parachutes provide. We were looking forward to landing on in half an hour, at 12:30. At 12:15, our FDO came on the air to ask my petrol state. I told him I was okay, obviously much too cheerfully, for he promptly asked me to make it 13:30, there's a good chap, and rang off before I could argue. It was painfully obvious that the relieving flight was not yet ready to take off. We had a brand new No. 4 in the flight, freshly arrived via the fleet train. He was just a boy. Now, over the wide, watery wastes of the Northwest Pacific, his schoolboy voice piped up.